My name is Weston, and welcome to Selling the Ages. This podcast is taking concepts throughout history and bringing them forward in time and how they're relevant in today's modern business culture. I'm a chief marketing officer with over a decade of experience in marketing strategy and executive leadership. And today I have with me my co-host and aunt, Lisa Shorts.
Hello, my name is Lisa Shorts, and I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of South Florida.
Today's one of our favorite podcast episodes, I think. Not only is it our first one, but also it's something that we've been able to talk about over the dinner table. Gladiators as a whole is just really, really popular, but I think it's super, super important for us to talk about kind of how the gladiators became such an integral part of history in terms of branding, but also the influencer economy. So that's kind of what we're going to be chatting about today, and I know that we've definitely chatted a lot about it in general.
It is my Roman Empire is part of my area of specialty, so it's the Roman Empire comes up a lot. So the joke going around now is, how often do you think of the Roman Empire? I think of it every day. And gladiators were a huge part of that because they were the modern athletes for the Romans, the way that we have the NFL and the NBA. And
absolutely. And you think of the modern day stadiums where anybody's going to walk into a stadium to watch your favorite sports team. Mine is the Bucks. So I walk into the Bucks stadium and it's laid out in the exact same format, in the exact same way, with section numbers and ticket numbers, exactly like we were experiencing or they experienced in the Gladiator Coliseum.
Concessions, fans, literally fans to keep themselves cool. It was that level of excitement building was just as prevalent at that time as we have it now. Think about how your heart pumps when you walk into a stadium and you see this is going to be an awesome game, especially for the big fans. Well, that hasn't changed.
That is so awesome. And, today's our first podcast, so I'm super excited to get into it. And I think how we kind of structure it, obviously, is I'd love to hear from you about how you kind of set the scene. What does that look like? Give us a rundown. I think everybody knows what gladiators are and who they were and what it represents. But I think that there's so much more hearing it from you and your perspective and understanding what that looks like.
Okay, let's talk about context first. So Rome's history tends to be divided into two sections, generally. The first is the Roman Republic, which is from its inception around 700 BCE to the death of Julius Caesar, 46 BCE. That's considered the Republican period. It's a little bit more complicated than that because in the beginning there were kings, and that was problematic for the Roman people, so they dispensed with the kings around 500 BCE and they changed to a republican form of government. After that, Augustus creates the Roman Empire. It becomes the imperial period, and that has a different set of values. So when I talk about the context, I will talk about it in those three areas. The gladiatorial games started as honorary funeral games. They would be in honor of, some important general or some important person, and 3 or 4 pairs of slaves would fight to the death as an honorific for this funeral, at this funeral.
Well, terrible.
It was awful, especially for the slaves.
Yeah.
And they were usually captured from some other area that Rome had. And keep in mind, by the way, Roman provinces didn't really exist for several hundred years. So Rome was a small city-state, basically, that had some arguments with its neighbors, the Italians, the Etruscans, and those arguments eventually developed into wars, and then Rome realized, well, wait a minute, we can start owning things, and that's where you get the provinces.
The real expansion came.
The real expansion. But before that, The gladiatorial games, as I said, were honorary funeral games. Well, they had entertainment value, and along the line, somebody figured this out and they began to expand. So think of a statesman's funeral, which is going to be much bigger. It's going to have more gladiatorial games. So then you're talking about 100 slaves as opposed to 6 to 8. And then they continue to get bigger. And then someone realizes, wait a minute, we can entertain an entire public with this form of gaming. So that is the point at which the games become a state-sponsored way to garner popularity with the public. That's in the imperial period. Now you have money concentrated in a certain area and in a certain individual, and that individual is trying to garner fame. So he or she decides, well, I'm going to support this gladiatorial construct in some way or another. There were some emperors who used this to their advantage in a huge way. There were some who really didn't like the gladiatorial games, and there weren't any, or there were few during their reigns. So it wasn't 1,000 years of popularity. There were parts of the history where it just wasn't that popular. It also evolved in the way they played the games. So, we've talked about the fact that there was a hugely political side to this. So things got added in, like criminals fighting for their lives against lions and tigers, or, the very popular notion that Christians were constantly burned at the stake inside the arena. While that is true, there isn't as much of that as people tend to think. It's a very complex topic, and it becomes more complex as the desire for entertainment expands. Imagine you're the public and you want bigger and bigger and bigger entertainment. And now imagine that you're a politician trying to garner fame. You are going to feed that level of entertainment to gain influence through the gladiatorial games.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that we see that in terms of the cinematic value that's used today when talking about gladiator games, and we see just like a very small snippet of what it is, maybe at the height of its expansion in the entertainment realm. But I definitely see that there could be times when maybe a certain emperor was not interested in using that as a public tool. But it is incredibly important, and I think that we see that today. I mean, if we kind of take a step back and say, is it a form of, political distraction? Is it a form of just straight entertainment value? Like all those things, all those concepts are used today. And that's really, really interesting. And there's definitely so many things I want to dive into in just that piece alone. But as a historical, that puts it in perspective, right? Like it came from being, like you said, this very small scale honorific kind of experience to this massive entertainment industry. It's just so interesting. And so I think what the lesson that we're taking out of this and what we'll be talking about today too is how did that branding of these individuals create such a huge economy, but not only that, but it almost has parallels with the creator economy that exists today. And I think that's so, so, so interesting. Okay, so I think coming out of that context, talking about what and who those gladiators are, and talking about it as a whole, right? Like the gladiators themselves were a brand. And I think that we can definitely dive a little deeper into that too. So when the gladiators were at the peak of their entertainment value, maybe you could describe a little bit about how the gladiators started to actually brand themselves. Like they became public figures because of maybe the way that they killed somebody, or like they had different titles and names that they called themselves. Like what did that look like?
They began as frequently already having been trained. So they were captured in another place. They were a soldier in that place. So they were already trained for combat. They come into the ring and they are capable of fighting and very much capable of surviving. But they also came into the ring as criminals who had no chance to survive any kind of fighting, and they were probably not going to survive a fight with a trained soldier. So because it had its roots in other perceptions of fighting, it had its physical roots in how fighters were trained. But eventually, as it became promoted by people who understood its influence, then free men and women wanted to get into the ring because they knew they could build wealth this way. Not just wealth, but attention. And their celebrity would increase in the way that they mostly fought. They were commodities, so the whole killing part was not as prevalent as people tend to believe it was. If you have invested, thousands and thousands of, I'm going to use the term dollars, obviously they didn't use dollars, into a person's training, you did not want that person hurt if you could avoid it. So as they continued to train to be entertainers, they didn't just train in fighting. They trained in how to fight in an entertaining way. So flourishes with their weapons and the type of weapons, and a reputation for being particularly good with a mace as opposed to a sword, or very good with a spear, or a character out of a historical period that Rome fought successfully in, fighting against the Carthaginians, for example. So there was a lot of personification in who the gladiators became. Also, a lot of people think that they were very thin and trim, like our modern NFL players are. They weren't. Because if you stab someone that has a dad bod, you're going to get less of an injury with a knife, for example. So there is some perception of how they are.
So the eight pack abs were not a thing, or were they a thing?
They were probably a thing with some people, but they were not necessarily a thing with others. If you cut through someone who has no space between the outside and the inside, and you hit an artery, that person's not going to survive. So my advising professor made a joke one time when he was doing a lecture about this, that they were probably chubbier than people perceive them to be for safety. So they were fed really well. That's why I brought that up.
They drank really well, I'm sure.
Everybody drank watered down wine at the time because it was the safest thing to drink. But there was investment made in their health, their personalities, their ability to entertain a crowd. I mean, think about it. Our most famous NFL players are the ones that have the biggest entertainment value in most cases. That may be because they are particularly good quarterbacks, or they have extreme number of sacks or runs, or whatever those statistics are that make them fun to watch. Well, you've got the same thing in the ancient athletes in the amphitheater.
Oh, absolutely. The branding itself, I think, is so key here, which is really where I want to kind of talk about not only just companies who utilize creators in a creator economy, because that's already just absolutely massive to what the current situation and state that we live in right now. The creator economy is massive. But I think boiling it down to the branding itself, I think that when you have an investor back in Gladiator days, I'm not a sponsor per se, and they have their favorite fighter, they know what sells that fighter. They understand their crowd or public value. And I think even looking at today's brands, maybe taking a step back from creators in general, but understanding how brands actually market themselves, and understand that you have to figure out what that value proposition is to make sure that you're delivering that so that your audience is receiving it. And that is a huge piece.
Different audiences for different parts of that brand. So the
absolutely.
Gladiators appealed to certain people because of their ability to fight. Some may have appealed because of their ability to mock their fighters. Some appealed to people for their reproductive ability.
Right.
So there were all kinds of reasons that gladiators, and keep in mind, there were both men and women gladiators, were engaged by the public. It wasn't just in the arena.
Right.
It was for personal entertainment. They may have come to somebody's home and fought for entertainment.
Really?
They may have been engaged by women for other reasons, for sexual reasons. There was plenty of that too. So I hate to use the word pimped, but the general concept of that word is they were a commodity and they were hired out for making money in several different ways. Their influence was bigger than just inside the arena.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that is, so, it's transcendent. We look at it exactly like we're saying with modern athletes. No, it's definitely not the same in a lot of ways, but on the big stage, it is the same. And you market them the same. And it doesn't even have to be, creator based, but just brands who understand, like, how does your story resonate with your audience? If you don't have that down, it doesn't matter what you're selling, whether it's a commodity, a person because they're a creator, a product, that doesn't matter. It comes down to how well you know your market and your target audience. And there's a lot of different ways to go through that. I mean, and where I come from is a world of marketing, right? Like you think about gladiators in Rome every day. I'm thinking about how can I push my brands further. And, I have worked with different companies from a lot of different stages in their brand building, experience. So ones that are very new, I'm building brand books for them. Ones that are in the middle of their stages and they're trying to scale. But it doesn't matter what that looks like. There's a huge process of understanding who your brand is and what you're trying to sell your audience. That is absolutely key. And if you don't have that piece, then you are not going to be as successful. There was a Harvard Business Review that said 30% of businesses who understand their consumer to a deeper degree will result in better conversion. And I mean, you don't even have to go by that number. I think that's just kind of common knowledge. Like, you have to understand who you're going for. So it is a really, really interesting. And I think also in terms of how the public in the gladiatorial games received that, right? Like, I know that we were talking a little bit about kind of how what we see in the movies now, or like the emperor standing on the stage and there's like the final fight scene and he's standing up and he has his thumb out and he's like, okay, asking the crowd what to do. And I know that that's definitely cinemified. But I'd love to talk about that for a minute.
It is cinemified. So Romans were very, very keen on symbols of power. And the body, parts of the body, had interesting communication, or represented interesting communications about power. Everybody knows that the phallus is, the big symbol of power in a lot of cultures, not just in Roman culture. But it was also apotropaic, which means it was considered a protection device. But an interesting thing about the Romans' view of how the hand was used has to do with the thumb. The thumb resembles an erect phallus, and it is also a source of communication about how power was to be used. So the movies tend to modernize our concept of that, the thumbs up symbol, because that's how we perceive it. We think thumbs up is okay, that's great.
Agree.
But that's not how it was used in the Roman Empire. An erect thumb or a pointed thumb was actually a communication of violence, not necessarily extreme violence, but it was a form of power. So a Roman emperor would not have done thumbs up to keep somebody alive. And again, go back to the fact that these were commodities. And just like racehorses, people were invested in these gladiators. So I don't know what the statistics are. I'd have to go back and research it. But this whole idea that the emperor went, yes, keep him alive, is not actually accurate. This would have been continue with the violence, or this would have been continue with the violence. The turning of the thumb had very specific implications.
Right.
And there are papers written about how the hand was used as communication. You know, everybody makes the joke about Italians speaking with their hands. There's a reason for that. So I suggest, if you're interested in that power dynamic, you read a little bit more about it. We'll include that in the bibliography. But I wish that cinema did more research about the small behaviors. In Gladiator 2, by the way, there are a lot of things that are not right about how they represented that series of events. But they did get a lot of little things correct, like the fact that she carries a nosegay with her all the time because the smell would have been horrendous.
Accurate.
There was more of the symbolism was accurate. So I don't know how much he consulted historians about the story, but they at least got those things right. And the gesturing was one of the things that they improved on. So I was happy to see that.
And, you know, when you're looking at, I believe that it would have been just as, you know, emotional inside of the stadium as we see on the movies, where people are getting up and screaming and yelling and watching their favorite gladiator. Absolutely. And it's also interesting to kind of see that reaction from your audience, right? Like, that is a live reaction to what's going on. That's your brand working in person.
Absolutely.
And I think that when I take a step back and look at the modern day application, I think about how brands need to personalize what they're doing to be able to reach their audiences. And if you're not doing that personalization piece, you're not reaching them emotionally, and they're not going to be as receptive to you. So unfortunately, we don't have a stadium of people that's going to give you a full R&D on, yes, this absolutely works. Like, we're loving this for your brand. Exactly. But at the end of the day, it's like the silent reception. You know, are people responding well to what you're putting out? Do they even resonate with your brand? All those questions need to be asked.
Do they understand your narrative?
Yes.
That's another big deal. How well can you know a brand if the brand doesn't have a good narrative? Look at travel branding, which, by the way, is also not new.
Yeah.
If you read travel journals, from ancient travel journals all the way through up into the modern travel journals, what is appealing about those things is how your audience perceives those places. It's one of the things that, as an ancient historian, I love watching in modern influencers. If I go to a place like Rome, I know we'll talk about that more in detail later, the things that I want to see are not the same as the things that perhaps a young 20-something wants to see right out of college who's looking to see the world.
Right.
You really have to understand, as an influencer, as a promoter, as a whatever, who the audience is that you're trying to reach. That is one of the things that these promoters, these gladiatorial promoters, understood about whipping up fervor in the amphitheater. Globalization is a modern version of the amphitheater because you can reach that many people in the same moment. But if you're not telling the story the right way, you lose your audience immediately. And I imagine you'll know more about this than me, that losing an audience as an influencer is not only instantaneous, it takes a great deal of effort to build that back up.
Absolutely. Well, it's just, you know, you break either the trust or you break the narrative, and the first person who's going to notice that your brand is inconsistent is your audience. It's not you. You don't realize it until you're seeing your metrics, and you're like, oh, I've had a really bad quarter this year, or this past quarter has been one of the lowest, in the past 2. And you have to take that kind of introspective look and say, what did we do wrong? What communication did we put out? Is there some sort of census around what we're doing that is not resonating well? And I think it's actually really funny too. We were chatting about how it doesn't always work. Like, in today's market, you have influencers who fall out of fame. You have people who create their branding and it just doesn't resonate. But then that also existed back in the day. We're talking about the Gladiators who never made it to the big stage.
That's true.
And that absolutely existed. And I know that we'll chat about that in just a second, but where I see it is, we've both traveled to Rome. I've been to the Colosseum, incredible experience. But I've also been to Pompeii, and Pompeii has a very small Colosseum, very small arena. And it's really interesting to see, maybe that was like what arena football is to the NFL. Like, and no disrespect, but it's just like, it's not necessarily the stage that everybody's looking at always. So people didn't do the branding piece right, even back then.
Or it could be the minor leagues where people are testing your ability to build a brand. That's where you start. So I see those smaller locations, more remote locations. Pompeii was a seaport, so you've got a lot of different types of traffic there. That would be a good proving ground, but it would also be a good, I hate to use the word retirement ground, but if you were, as you said, the kind of entertainer that didn't hit, you might end up in a small locale working really hard to stay alive in a very, very physical
and
form of entertainment. Exactly.
And very, very dangerous.
And very, very dangerous form of entertainment. Reminds me of your Uncle Adam, because he was playing in the minor leagues. He hurt himself. His career was over.
Right.
And there's that too. What if you are a gladiator that gets injured so badly you can no longer practice? What do you do? Do you become a trainer? Do you become a medic? There were medics that Galen, the most famous Roman doctor of all time, started out as a surgeon in adjacent to the arena. So these guys would come out of the arena, cut up, whatever, he'd stitch them up, send them back in. It was his job to make sure that they stayed the commodity that they were. So he got influence in the medical world because of his experiences as a gladiator's surgeon. It's the idea of influence then was as far-reaching and as deep as what it is now. And it still goes back to a narrative. I can patch up a gladiator. I must be a really good surgeon.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't think branding is one of those things that is sold through the test of time. We will always have that because everybody has to find a way to make money, and you have to figure out what your differentiator is. What is your value proposition? How are you different? What are your pillars? And I think that when people are creating their brand pillars, they have to ask themselves this, like, what do you stand on as a brand emotionally? What values, what ethics? It comes down to your mission, your values of a company. And it comes down to who you are as a creator or an individual who's also in the influencer space. What target audience are you trying to reach? And I think that there's been people who've done it very successfully, obviously, and then there's people who haven't, which we definitely chatted about. But the mirrors are there. I had a couple things written down about how there is such a very interesting mirror about everything that we're talking about, which I think we've shown. But different things like, gladiators were backed by patrons and sponsors. Today, modern influencers are backed by brands and sponsors, backed by money. You have performance for survival, performance for engagement, but also survival because people need to make money and it's their living. You have fan and graffiti, and then you also have follower count and your engagement rates online. So I think that's also really interesting too, because there's the whole graffiti concept and the statues that happened in Roman times.
Romans love their graffiti.
Yes, they do. And I think that's also really important to talk about too. Like when you had your favorite gladiator back in the day, Was there posters for them per se, or paintings, graffitis? Like how did they make their commodity of the gladiator publicly kind of, I would say, like how was it?
How did they communicate it?
How did they communicate it? How did people get a statue of their own?
The sources on this are very, very limited, unfortunately, as far as the painting, that kind of thing. Posters, they may have made them, but they would have made them on some form of material like linen or something like that.
Right.
And they don't survive.
Yeah.
It is very rare, and I have a colleague who can speak more to this. It's very, very rare to find intact textiles, leather, anything that is biodegradable, because it has to occur in very specific conditions. So if they did make posters, we don't have any evidence of it. That would be amazing if we'd ever find something like that. But they did paint on walls. Anybody who's ever walked through Pompeii has seen that it was an easy way to communicate, because it didn't matter what language you spoke. Visual is visual. So there is evidence, I'll have to find the source, of a painting of a gladiator that we know about that was kind of a promotional thing. But there's plenty of graffiti, and the graffiti would tell the story of the battle in the arena. And this was amazing. And then there are descriptions in the written sources too. So that's how we know about the naval battles and the amazing other things that they did in the arena. Imagine sitting in that arena and they fill it with water and you have warships coursing through the arena.
It's unbelievable.
It would be a mind-blowing concept. For anybody sitting there. I mean, you forget about the mechanics of doing it. Just watching it would be, the level of entertainment would be huge. So I do believe that there were, they had to have communicated those kinds of things in a very public way. And the Colosseum takes up so much physical space in Rome. It has so much square footage around the outside that you could have hung banners and things like that from.
Absolutely.
And I think it's fairly common knowledge now that they had a canopy that was mechanically, and some of our modern stadiums have this too, where you could roll the canopy in. Exactly. Not in Florida. So we know that there were, that the use of banners was there, but nothing remains that we have found so far, at least not to my knowledge. If someone knows that there is something, please let me know. But the graffiti still remains. So we do have these etchings of gladiatorial combats on the sides of buildings. And it is in those sources that we find a lot of the narrative. Now, the big remaining thing that historians tend to use for ancient studies is epitaphs. So we know that people are gladiators or gladiatrixes because it says it on their tombstones.
Right.
Using the term tomb loosely. So we read about who they were based on either what they wanted written about themselves, or about
self-branding there.
Lots of self-branding on tombstones. We could do a whole episode on that. But the other part is somebody who either owned that person, I hate to use the word owned, but that is their perception, and also people who loved them. So if a gladiator retired, lived to a ripe old age, and had many, many wins in the arena, probably retired wealthy, then his epitaph would have his achievements on it. And we do have lots of evidence of that. But the promotional material, if you think about it, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. These stadiums held, even the smaller stadiums held thousands of people. Getting the word out would mean some kind of physical communication. We know they had tokens. I think you mentioned when we were talking about the chicken bones, the etched chicken bones, that's something I had forgotten about.
That's the ticket stub, you know? And so, and that, like, just to kind of touch on our experience there too, you know, it was as someone who's just a history buff, but somebody who's, their profession is in history, it was a very moving experience. It's also the grandiosity is just so incredible.
Yeah.
And when you arrive there, and I'm sure a lot of people who may be watching have been, because it's a really popular tourist spot, but when you arrive there, it looks exactly like you're going into a normal stadium that you do every day. The same exact structures. So the ticket that you would receive now digitally was etched on a chicken bone, and that's incredible. And then you find your seat number, and probably divided by social class, which is unfortunate for them. But at the end of the day, I mean, unfortunately, there's more expensive tickets and there's less expensive tickets. That's just what it is. But it's just so incredible.
Always will be, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. You pay for privilege.
Yeah, and that's the reality. But being able to, when I went, I actually went with a group who had excavated part of the Colosseum. So the woman that took us, who was our tour guide, was incredibly well-versed in everything. She obviously was there. She was a historian. And we got to go underneath, and we got to see where, the gladiators were actually walking out or lifted up onto the stadium.
The elevator systems are
amazing. I mean, they were lifting elephants. So they're lifting the largest animals that exist on the planet up into the arena to fight against, whether it was slaves or whether it was the most famous gladiator. It's just it's so interesting to think about, and it was a very surreal experience to walk where they once walked.
Imagine the engineering it took to do that, which speaks to the cost of doing this form of entertainment. In the Republican period, there was a position known as an aedile. Aedile is how it is spelled. They were responsible out of their own pockets for providing entertainment to the public. And that could be a number of different kinds of things. Feast days, Romans had lots and lots of feast days. And part of that was putting on games.
Yeah.
Imagine the expense. Even before the OG Colosseum, the one that's in Rome, you had the building of the edifice. You had literally the branding of the edifice. For example, if you go to the Pantheon, whose name is written across the top of the Pantheon?
I'm not remembering. Was it
Agrippa?
Okay, got it.
Talk about branding.
Yeah, 100%.
He put his name on the edifice of one of the oldest remaining buildings in the world. So all of this went into branding yourself as a public figure that was pro-people. Mm-hmm. And then you get into the imperial period, and Augustus trying to brand himself as the father of the Roman people, mm-hmm. and providing not just entertainment, but also a daily food allowance called the annona. And there were other things that these promoters would do to have people get invested in their leadership. And that included, as we were talking about before, the best possible entertainment.
Yeah. Keep the people happy.
Keep the people happy, not just with who you provide to entertain, but how that person is enabled to entertain. Mm-hmm. Like I said, the naval battles, the pulley systems that brought people into the arena and out of the arena. It's a lot of big entertainment psychology. Look at the ship in Tampa Stadium.
Oh, absolutely.
Do we not lose our minds when the cannons start going?
Oh, I know, 100%. It gets the people going.
It gets the people going. We get truly invested in a touchdown because we know there's a cannon that's getting ready to go off. Mm-hmm. All of that was built into the spectacle, that's an important word here, of the gladiatorial entertainment.
Yeah. And I think just, talking about just the creators themselves, mm-hmm. right? Like they were the ancient creators. They were the ancient athletes. We've established this. But looking forward to today and the creator economy and what that means to have your own brand, whether you're making the money yourself or you're a brand who's hiring a creator to actually go and promote what you're selling. It is so incredibly important to tap into that market. The influencer economy is not only booming right now, but what it's projected to become is going to be a terrible thing for a brand not to invest in. I was reading this article about how Gen Z as a whole, they trust influencers more than they do celebrities and most public figures. And I think that's been a huge shift. I think even as a millennial, and where I came from is we were always looking at People magazine and all these different things that kind of
17 magazine.
They're
Vogue.
just like us. That's what I think about when I look at these celebrities. But then you have the Gen Z population who they grew up on YouTube. And so the YouTube era is so massive that these influencers have become incredibly important to their daily lives. Yeah. Instead of watching TV, cable, streaming, they watch YouTube. It's a completely different experience. So not tapping into that market, not understanding how to bring creators into your daily marketing strategy is a miss, and there's a lot of ways to do it. But it's just really interesting because that's what we've done throughout time. You look at Rome, you look at actually many other periods that we're just talking about Rome today. Exactly. It's incredible. It really is. And there's so much money to be made there.
The idea of influencers in ancient times, not just Rome, but anywhere in the ancient world.
Yeah.
I specifically study the Mediterranean because I got into studying the Mediterranean because that's where my personal history comes from.
Mine too.
Well, that is true. What I found most interesting about it, one of the many reasons that the Mediterranean had such a productive economy was because there was a group of people, the Punics, also known as the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians, who had mastered the idea of picking up a cool product over here and circling the Mediterranean with it and making everybody along the way believe they needed that product. Now, some of the products were commodities like wood and fuel sources and foodstuffs, wine, wheat, things like that. But they also bartered in textiles, in dyes for textiles. I mean, you had to have Punic purple.
Yeah.
It was a big deal. So the idea of influencing started with the fact that there were people that understood that this product that is made in, let's say, Syria is going to be really popular somewhere over here in Spain. And that was the reason that the Punics developed such a big, I don't want to say empire because it really wasn't an empire, because they didn't have empire mentality. But they dotted the Mediterranean in all of these markets. They were probably not the first influencers, but we have evidence that they were really, really successful at it. So how did they market their products? It was a person. It's not like they took a flyer from Syria to Cadiz and said, here, check out this product that you can order from over here. They sold the people on the popularity of these things. They just did it without cell phones.
Very hard to do these days.
Very hard.
But, it's that concept where branding is, for lack of a better terms, being sold through the ages. It's the concept that has carried through time.
And
I know
they were trusted. That's the thing that blows my mind about it. Why were those people trusted over someone else?
Because they had a platform. They had a stage. They had something that they could really, really convince someone of, even if they're not an expert in it.
And they were probably consistent as well.
And I do think that there's a bit of a trap nowadays with that too. Like, maybe not trusting every single thing online from every single person who has a platform. And I think that's really important for us all to consider. And especially when brands are picking influencers who stand for something, that's when your brand pillars have to match what that deal is going to be with that specific brand. Are your target audiences going to match? Do they have similar values? Without that connection, you're missing the market. You're missing the mark completely, and you're going to be wasting money on both sides who are investing in each other.
And just as that mob mentality that in the arena, watching the gladiator they love, just as they began to love an entertainer, they could just as easily hate one.
Absolutely.
And that mob mentality is easily turned from a positive to a negative if you are inconsistent in your message. A lot of emperors didn't do well because of that particular thing. They didn't read their audience.
Yep.
And it didn't matter how many games, how many entertainments, how much they did for the people, their core message didn't match up. And their brand failed miserably.
And you see that today. It's very obvious today. Brands that had a huge flop. I think one of the biggest ones is, unfortunately, the Bud Light situation. That, just not even trying to dive into it, but I mean, the fallout of, I think, how out of touch the experience was for both parties created a massive, massive fallout. That was one of the worst rebranding and marketing campaigns. The ripple effect from that was so severe that I think a lot of brands took a step back and were like, hey, let's make sure that we really, really understand who our target is, because that was severely off.
Yeah, you can't say everybody's your audience.
No.
That won't work.
Because you have, something that everybody could have doesn't mean that everybody wants it.
Exactly. Or wants to have it in that particular way.
Right.
And that goes back to what I said about one emperor being, yes, games, awesome, let's have games. And then another emperor eschewing the idea altogether.
And it's so interesting. So what do you think are kind of like the biggest lessons or takeaways from this period of time with branding and also just the gladiator era in general?
Well, the idea that you want to garner an audience is certainly not new. It's not Roman. It's not Greek. It's human. And from the first time humans started to gather in urban areas, there was a need to make some kind of living, and that in some cases meant marketing something. Now, the market economy where people brought their goods to market, that's easy. You walk down the street, you hawk your wares, that's an easy sell. But if you want to build a brand as a leader, not necessarily an emperor, because again, the games were happening before the imperial period.
What it is,
Right.
We know what it is.
So if you are a politician or even a business person, it doesn't necessarily have to be a politician. If you are a person whose wealth is built on a product, you have to understand that delivering to your audience is the way that you get people to come back for more. In the case of the gladiators, the best, wealthiest, most influential gladiators were the ones that provided the best entertainment value. And they learned to do that in their training. Keep that in mind. They didn't just learn to fight. They learned to fight with flair.
Yeah.
And that flair is what gathered people to their shows.
Yeah.
And
That's what sold them.
exactly.
It is.
So, and the leaders, the political leaders of the period understood that.
Yeah.
The business people of the period understood that. Watch Gladiator 2 just to watch how Macrinus behaved. Because I bring that up not necessarily because it's historically accurate and I don't want to get a bunch of hate mail about that fact, but they portrayed him as understanding brand. So it's important to understand the characters that were generating all this brand at the time for what they were doing. Some of it was just plain, I want to undermine the establishment that there is, and some of it was, I want to be understood this way, and that's how they built their promotion. And part of that was, look at what I can do for you. Look at the entertainments I bring you.
And that equals power. And then actually most of them who were able to reach that certain level, their way of life completely changed. They became a celebrity. That's just what it is. So I look at it like, having that brand consistency, having a very clear narrative of who you are, whether you are the influencer yourself or whether you are the brand. It does not matter what you are selling, and it doesn't even matter in this case if you're hiring an influencer as part of your marketing strategy. But if you do not have that brand consistency, if you do not have the full, deep understanding of your customer, and then also being able to personalize it to them as well, using systems like CRMs, HubSpot, the Salesforce, Klaviyo, all these different tools that you utilize to make sure that you understand and they are receiving it. Because you can build up a brand, but if it's not being received, then it is absolutely wasting money.
They have to be reached, and they have to be reached at a very personal, emotional level. People do not buy things. They don't go to see an entertainer unless there is some huge emotional connection. Look at Taylor Swift.
Yeah.
Half the reason that she is as popular as she is because her audience identifies with her.
Oh, yeah.
That's huge entertainment value.
Absolutely. And there's so many examples of that. So many examples of successful celebrities and influencers who have built their brand to transcend, almost like cultural zeitgeist. Like they are top tier celebrities, top tier influencers who have become much more. And one of the examples too I look at is like Alex Earl. She is an influencer who started just making vlogs about her day-to-day life, and now is absolutely blowing up as a A-list celebrity who feels approachable. And so her brand is that you saw me when I was at University of Miami and I was talking to you about getting ready for a tailgate, and I'm still talking to you in the exact same fashion, but I'm getting ready for the Met Gala. And it's that breaking the fourth wall where you feel connected. And so what she stands for, she still is creating this incredible brand around her, and it still feels approachable. And I think that is one of her pillars, to make sure that she maintains this kind of personable level with her audience. And there's so many examples of that.
And the fact that you're reaching, before celebrity was TV distance, movie screen distance. It's not that anymore. They're on your phone, your personal device. So you feel like you are being personally reached because you are looking through the portal directly at that person. It's definitely narrowed the distance between who the influencer is and what you're trying to receive from the influencer. In the case of the arena, you still got 20,000 people staring down at a person with some distance. It was live distance, granted, but
that's an immediate feedback loop.
It's an immediate feedback loop, and you could hire that person personally if you were able to reach the promoter, or there was a system in place to get you close to that brand. And to be clear, the Gladiator is the brand. His or her influence is based on how much entertainment he or she could whip up. The promoter was the conduit, and that hasn't changed.
No, it's exactly the same. And I think, the brands, the companies of tomorrow are not going to be, in my opinion, based off of just brands. They're going to be based off of people. And I think that personal touch, the way that our entire marketing strategy as a whole for both business to business and business to consumer is that people don't want to just follow brands. People want to follow people.
Yes.
I work with a lot of brands who actually are really minimizing how much they're talking about their company, right? You putting so much effort onto doing a marketing strategy for your company Instagram account. But how many people truly want to sit on their phone on a couch in between their show and just kind of see what, your fellow, restaurant is doing, or whatever service or product you provide? It's very rare that you're going to be able to really achieve a successful social media strategy as a brand, versus maybe your executive is the person that needs to be now being, the magnifying glasses on them, they become the brand. You start talking so that people feel like you're talking to the person who created this and there's a story behind it. And Or maybe it's not the executive and it's a few very specific people in your company that have good, video presence. I mean, we work with brands as a chief marketing officer. I work with brands who have gone down that strategy where we're no longer putting an emphasis on doing the social media strategies for the company itself. We're taking charismatic people from their executive leadership board or their sales team who can connect with people. And that's
Charismatic is the key word, because without charisma, you have nothing.
Yeah.
People identify with other people, as you just said. And if I am looking at, funny enough, if I go to YouTube, I go follow history influencers like Professor Mary Beard, Dame Mary Beard, who has been talking about classics for 40 years. I trust who she is. She's done television shows, she's written books, she does lectures, she is a sourced influencer in our industry.
Yeah.
Now, there are others, I'm just naming her because I happen to have recently watched a YouTube video of her, but that's where I go to get historical influence. Not material necessarily for what I write. I will go to the sources that person is talking about for the things that I am required to write. But if I want to feel inspired about the fact that I love history, I go watch someone else that's inspired too. And if I want to pick a good restaurant, I want to be able to put myself in that person's shoes. That has not changed.
Yeah.
And if you are a teenage boy sitting in the arena in Rome and you're watching a gladiator who's wielding a sword and the women are swooning because the women swooned, what do you think that's going to do to you as a young man? That's the influence that he's looking for.
Yeah, 100%.
And I'm sure that there were females that felt the same way about the female gladiators too. I wish we could talk more about that topic, but it's a very, very deep topic. But the people who did the best, the people who had the most popularity, both as promoters and as leaders in ancient times, were the people that got the public's approval. And that's what an influencer does for you. That narrative that charismatic person gives in that video is going to pull people who are looking for connection.
Absolutely.
That's the big deal.
It's the
connection to what doesn't matter, but
Right.
they're looking for the connection that you are providing.
And it's not necessarily the brands who are speaking the loudest. It's the brands who are reaching deeper into that emotional connection.
Or removing something that has negatively impacted. Coffee shops are a great thing that I'm thinking about right now, because I like smaller coffee shops. The intimacy of being in a coffee shop or a wine shop or whatever is the selling point now. People don't want the big corporate thing. They want to be able to go in and have a conversation and enjoy the environment. And that too hasn't changed. We could get into some heavy discussion about promoting food in ancient times, because there was fast food and there was concessions. I have the best pizza.
Yeah.
Although pizza didn't exist like it does now, but all of that appeals to something enticing. Is that really the right word?
Yeah.
So that person with the charisma is quite literally enticing you into enjoying whatever he or she is enjoying.
Yeah. And I think to kind of wrap everything, I mean, it's exactly what, we believe it to be. Brands will stand the test of time when they have the public's opinion and approval and
adaptability. Look at what happened to JCPenney's, Sears. Sears used to be the brand for tools.
Yeah.
What happened? Home Depot.
Yep. Competition's always going to be there, but
and knowing your evolving audience. We talked about the whole Gen Z thing, that they trust influencers more than they trust celebrities.
That personalization piece, knowing your target audience, I think that is truly what transcends time. It doesn't matter if it was the Gladiators, and it doesn't matter if you're a current influencer of today. You have to reach the right audience, and you have to brand yourself to be accepted by the public. That's what it is.
What do you, just a quick thought too, have you noticed that the British Museum has started to issue social media in Gen Z speak?
Yes, and so many brands are doing that.
Which is absolutely hysterical. Even as a Gen Xer, I'm aging myself, I find that really funny.
Yeah.
And I thought that is brilliant adaptability, because the next audience is going to be my kid, my grandkids someday. That is going to keep them fresh. And the British Museum has to struggle to stay fresh because of their history.
There's a little controversy on them, for sure.
Not just them, they're not the only ones.
And definitely not.
And museums are trying hard, history centers are trying hard to be not just relevant for today, but also responsible for today. So I don't want to sound like I am critical of the great institutions. There's plenty to go around, both positive and negative. But that one thing that I noticed that they were doing lately is going to take them into the future.
I mean, same thing with the National Park System. I don't know if you follow them online. It's hilarious. HubSpot, which I'm, very big into and certified, and I love that transition from when they were speaking so kind of from a different level and trying to teach, kind of coming from a platform trying to teach, versus now it's memes and jokes. And
they can still teach.
Absolutely. But it just resonates.
It does. And the best professors have great sense of humor.
Yeah.
They make people laugh in their class. That is not going to change either. So the whole idea of understanding your narrative as it evolves, because it's going to evolve every 10 years, that has not changed.
No, it hasn't. And I think that was awesome. I mean, I really appreciate you just kind of joining in today, and on all these podcasts. It's going to be super exciting to talk about all the different things that we're going to kind of go through. I mean, mind you, this is just conversations we normally have over a dinner table. So,
which is why I can't the source is, because I actually have to be looking at my sources, which I'm happy to provide. But there's so much to be read about the Roman Empire, about the transition from monarchy to republic to imperial, the role of the Greeks. I mean, just scratch the surface takes 40 years.
Exactly. But it's definitely not going to be our only topic on this era, I'm sure.
No, we'll come up with some other fun stuff.
Right. And I think it was awesome. Like there's absolutely that transcendent, concept throughout time. It has been sold through the ages, which is exactly why we wanted to make our podcast so indicative of all these lessons that we can take with us. Because if we're not evolving and we're not learning from the past, unfortunately, you're not going to be successful.
And to be clear for your audience, what we're trying to do is not presentism. We're not saying that the things that happened in Rome are equivalent to what is happening today. No one can say that, because their perception of things was very different from ours.
Right.
That is a known fact. We can read that in their documentation. We can see that in certain things that are important to their lifestyles. And we can't take anything from the ancient world except maybe wheat, things that are salt that are tangible. We can't bring that into the present and say it's exactly the same.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean we can't study humanity as a species and understand that the things that are important to us were probably important to them too. Eating, sleeping, having children, all of those human things had affected the way that they saw things, like, the gladiatorial games. Kind of the same way that we do. We want entertainment as part of being human. How we achieve that, can't really
That's the
compare.
question. Can you actually make it into the big arena?
And exactly, that is really the bottom line. Do you have the chops? Do you have the charisma? Do you have the entertainment value?
Yeah.
Can you brand in a lasting way?
Yeah. And I love that. So thank you again. Also wanted to give a shout out to Voir View Media for filming and producing us. So it's been awesome. Thank you so much for everybody who's listening as well. We've got a long road and many periods and eras and conversations to talk about. So if you like what you hear, just go ahead and subscribe and listen for more.